Do you think that players are oftentimes held to a higher standard than coaches? And isn't it interesting that you can have a dream, live that dream, and not enjoy that dream? Hi, I'm Becky Burley, co-founder of What Drives Winning with Brett Ledbetter. On this episode of What Drives Winning Conversations, we explore those questions and more with our two very distinguished guests, Boston Celtics GM Brad Stevens and former collegiate football coach Chris Peterson. Brett started off by showing Brad an interview that they did over 10 years ago. Take a listen.
Well, I think the bottom line is you've got to move on from adversity, and you've got to move on from success. In a game of 150 possessions, you're going to have a lot of both. And the people that can maintain an even keel and a consistent approach and move on to the next play and focus on winning the next play, you have a better chance of winning the game. You know, we always say win the next game one possession at a time. You know, there needs to be no goal other than that. You know, you can have a goal of trying to win the national championship or get into a Final Four or whatever the case may be. It's baby steps. There's a process to get there, and your focus has got to be on that.
So, Brad, when you see that, and that was taken 10 years ago, where does your mind go?
Well, I look younger, but I don't think my mind has changed all that much on that. I think momentum can certainly play a role in games. There's no question about it, but I think the toughest minded teams, the teams with the most answers on offense and defense, and the teams with the most answers throughout the course of a season can move on to what's next very quickly and do so without much, over emotion, right? They don't get too down on themselves. They don't get too high on themselves, and they just move on to what's next. And, the 82 game schedule in the NBA, that clearly was a interview when I was at Butler, or maybe just finishing up Butler. But that the NBA is just a different animal. Like, you just have to be able to move on. And I think that probably stays more true than not 12 years later.
What would you do differently in college with the information that you got from the NBA?
I don't know that I'd do much structurally differently as far as the day-to-day approach. I don't think that really changed a lot coming here, or if I were to go back. I think that, it would be maybe a little bit more tactical, offensive and defensive things that are more specific to the game. And I think that's probably because the game, to keep up with the game, to keep up with the things that are happening in the game, you got to stay on your toes. And the NBA does a good job of that. Like, right when you think you've got something figured out, everybody's adjusted to it and you got to figure out what's next. So I'd say it'd be more tactically, the tactical changes would be the biggest change for me.
Well, I want to fast forward a couple of years, and Chris, this is where I'm going to bring you in. So, Brad, this was in 2017, and we were talking about the blank banner that hung from the rafters. And so, Chris, I'm going to play this, and then I just want your response.
Even if we're fortunate enough to someday achieve that 18th banner for the Celtics, the next day we're going to be pursuing 19.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, they have that perspective on, winning a championship and hanging the banner, and that's all anyone cares about from the outside, the fan base, players. It's just all about the next banner, and to have that perspective, like, okay, so we're going to hang the banner and we're on to the next thing. At that age, is pretty impressive, and not at that age, at that young age, but like, even in this day and age, like right now, to keep that in perspective is pretty impressive.
Brad, is that true?
100%. 100% true. And I'm glad that it's been validated. It's been nice to live winning it, but it's also been nice to see that life doesn't change. I think you just try to stay true to who you are, try to be the best that you can be. And you try to, you take on the next challenges. I had a good friend of mine who, has a lot of great relationships in sports say, one of the things you learn, the better that you get or the more accomplishments you add to the resume is it's never enough, right? So if it's never enough, then just focus on the good stuff, focus on getting better and focus on the people you're with. And and try to make it a great experience so that whenever it's over, it's something that you can all look back fondly on and proud of, and appreciate the relationships you built along the way. Because if it's only about the results, or if it's only about, the things that, if you wrap your identity around trophies and, individual glory or whatever the case may be, it's just probably going to be probably not as fulfilling as it could be.
Back in the day, Belichick, one of the things that he said is that the deeper you have a run go in the postseason, that's directly correlated with how far you are behind other organizations. And again, he was the first person that kind of put that in my head. Have you thought about that at all, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, it's different. It's different in the NBA, just because we only have 2 rounds in our draft. There's only been one year that we've had more than one pick, and it was this year, but it was 30 and 54. It wasn't like it was 1 and 8. So yeah, there's some of that, and then the other part of it is we don't have 53 spots to fill. We have 14, and for us, we already had 11 on contract coming back. So I would say that it's probably season to season, experience to experience, and maybe that's the case more in football than in basketball. But I feel like that's our job as a front office, is to not necessarily be inundated with the moment, but to have more of the 10,000-foot view. And, we're doing our draft meetings and we're having our draft workouts all the way through the finals. And, as much as you're in it, you're also doing the stuff to get ready for the future.
Chris, can you just explain to people how you can dream of going to a Rose Bowl, go to a Rose Bowl, and not enjoy the Rose Bowl?
Yeah, I think when you're so truly just focused on the winning and losing part of things, when that becomes the majority of everything, that is going to be a hard way to exist when probably maybe you don't match up as good as you think you should, or you don't win the game. It's just the classic thing of like, hey, you work your whole life to get to whatever, a Rose Bowl, an NBA championship. And, if that is really it and you put too much weight on that, you're going to be disappointed at the end of that process, really, however it goes. Going back to what Brad was saying, you hang the banner and now what? Or you don't get it and you're like devastated. And you think, if I would have got it, everything changes, and nothing changes.
I had a coach tell me when we went to our first Final Four, he said, better take an hour and walk around and kind of soak it in and enjoy it, which I didn't do. I didn't do it in the second Final Four either, and I haven't done it since. The first time I ever was around the crowds was in a parade after we won it. And it's too bad, because I do think that gives you a perspective on the joy and excitement that maybe you don't feel when it's your job, right? That you get as a fan or a family friend or whatever the case may be. And but it's hard to do, Chris. I'm in the exact same boat. You don't think about enjoying it. You think about playing well, and that's all you're really consumed with and focused on.
Yeah. And I actually think I was better when I first became a head coach of handling a big win or maybe a loss than I was later, because it just, the beast, it's just like, are you winning? It's not enough. And, my first year when we go to the Fiesta Bowl and win, I remember right after the game, people are going crazy and, the dramatics of the game. And I'm really kind of thinking, well, we pulled games out before, like we've won tight games, and kind of almost chuckling like how crazy people were going on this thing. And, then you fast forward into my career towards the end, and now I'm totally caught up in that stuff where I was better younger.
Brad, do you relate to that at all?
There's a power in being naive, for sure. Yeah. I think that would be. I think that can be the case with players too. I do think that experience, wins out probably more so than not. But there is a power of being young and not really knowing what's coming or not really understanding the magnitude of the moment you're in. You see that all the time, and certainly felt like that. I don't know if I certainly think I felt like that somewhat as a coach at that age, but I also probably had more of a fear of failure than I have, as I've turned into my 40s and now late 40s. I think that that's something that, gets replaced by the good stuff as you get a little bit older.
Why weren't you able to walk around?
I didn't, I don't know how Chris is with this. I don't, I kind of like putting my headphones in and my hat on and just walking and enjoying it to myself. Right. It was a little bit harder in those moments. And you're always thinking about what's next. You're always working on the next thing. And, I think that that's with whatever hours in the day that you have, you think that you can use that hour to try to, prepare one more thing that might help you win the game by one possession. And, our worlds come down to one possession a lot. And so I think there's a fine line. And, as we've talked before, there's a diminishing point of return, and you just have to find that. I think it's easier to find over the course of time. But, when you're in it, again, it's like you're in it to win it. You're in it to, you're not there satisfied that you're there. And you're just trying to do everything you possibly can. And you owe it to your team to do everything you possibly can to try to help them get over the top. But I certainly probably could have squeezed in a 45-minute or hour walk.
Hey, Chris, do you want to respond to that?
It's like, okay, this was great, but now where are we going with this? Like the the to-do list just got longer of like, if we're going to sustain this, now we really got some things to get done.
Well, Brad, one of my favorite things talking to you about this stuff is that you get your confidence from preparation, but then there is a point of diminishing returns. And where is that line? And one of the things that has become a realization for you throughout your career is that going to dinner is also preparation if you're building trust with the guys, as opposed to maybe crunching one more game of film. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think there's just, I think Chris and I both probably were towards the end of a coaching era where it was about burning the midnight oil, and that was the only way to do it, right? And that's kind of how you learned how to do it. And certainly, with the technology advances that we have now, specifically with cutting up film and watching film and being able to access film, life is much more efficient than it once was to get the information that you need to get. But there's no question that there's a balance of preparation, which needs to be extreme and well done, and your own wellness, right? And your own, rest and nutrition and relationship and everything else that comes with, being at your very best when your best is needed. And I think that, again, these are all things that I think that everybody knows. I think it gets challenged big time in an 82 game season in the NBA, especially. And I think it's one of the things that our current coach, Joe Mazzulla, does such a great job of, because he's well prepared. He works really hard at it, but he's also really good at delegating and really trusts his people to do their work and make sure to take time for what's important for him to be good.
One of the things that you say is that players are held to a higher accountability for selflessness than coaches. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not always the case, obviously, but, if a player misses an extra pass, it gets shown in film. Sometimes it gets shown on clips and gets thrown all over the internet. Right. And, if somebody is, shooting a large volume of shots, whatever, get labeled as a selfish player. I just think that, we ask these guys when they go out and perform to not only be amazing and the best in the world, but also to be almost hold them to a different standard than we hold everybody else in the building. I think that we all have individual pride. We all have individual ambition. We see that every day. We see that in conversations. We see that in the way people act. It's sometimes, we see that in coach's behavior, front office behavior, whatever the case may be, right? And so I just think it's important to remember that first and foremost, as much as they seem like superheroes when they put their capes on and go perform in front of 18,000 people every night, that these are super talented, highly prideful people who are given everything they have so that their team can have success and the organization can have success. And we just have to remember they're also human. And so, we try to say, hey, like, we shouldn't be holding our best players or even our players that aren't playing to a different standard than anyone else in the building for how to put team first, but also balance that with individual ambition and pride.
Hey, Chris, to that point, a great tool for coaches would be just asking themselves two questions. The first question is, what do you not like about your team? The second question is, how do you fix that in you? What are the significance of those two questions, Chris?
Well, I think the significance of that is what I've learned, and it's taken me a long time to figure this out. It's all about me. It almost doesn't matter about what our team's doing first and foremost. It's about me first and foremost. And am I living at my best? Am I performing at my best? Like, I think when we go to games, we think, oh yeah, gosh, I hope these guys are ready to perform at a high level. I hope they're really ready to compete. And I start thinking, like, well, what about us as coaches? Like, what's our standard of performance when we're going into the arena? What does that look like? Like, we seem to push everything on those guys. And, oh yeah, you messed that up, or you didn't do that, or that was great. And, our role, our level of performance is to support that. And really, when it's not going well, that's when we need ourselves at our best. I don't think any of this, when I think about what real great coaching looks like or great leadership looks like, I think it really only matters when it's hard and when the storm is there, when adversity hits. What do you look like? What does your standard of performance look like as a coach and as a leader?
Chris, if someone stuck a camera on you your entire career and you were watching yourself and evaluating, what would you learn about yourself on the sideline?
Yeah, I think, well, I already know this, and that I'm probably not having a lot of fun by the look on my face, and they'd be right. I was fairly stoic because, like you talked about, I didn't want my team to lose their poise or be all over the place. It's like we're kind of on a mission here. But I also think there's a fine line to being on a mission and playing and coaching with joy and purpose. One of the ways that we compete our best or we grow the most is when there's a fun and a joy element woven throughout this process. And I think it's very easy to lose focus of that.
I think this clip's going to illustrate that. So, Brad, I'm going to show you this. This is of Chris a few years ago, right after he stepped down. I want to play this and just get your reaction to it. You asked your wife a question.
Yeah. So and this was just the other day, as thinking about all these things. It's like if we had had a really unbelievable year and went back to the playoffs, or, had lost one game and playing in a big time bowl game, do you think I would have stepped away? And she was like, "Ooh, probably not." And I'm like, really? And I thought about it, and the only thing I could think about, I didn't know if I would have or not. I thought it was interesting because I was so convinced and convicted, like this is the time. It just didn't feel right. But what made me think about is like how winning can just mask so many things and just keep you on the treadmill doing the same things and focusing on the same things you probably shouldn't be focusing on.
So, Brett, obviously that was a conversation that Chris had with his wife. Where does your mind go when you see that?
Yeah, I don't know what Tracy would say in that regard. I think that I know just from having known Chris since he's been done coaching, when we started on Zooms maybe a few years ago, that he probably was feeling the exact same internally, whether he was winning or losing or drawing. It was just, the losing is miserable, but the winning is, um, it becomes like we talked about, it becomes never enough. And so you just are always focused on what's next. And you always are mindful of how fragile it all is. And that misery of losing is right around the corner if you don't control what you can control. And all of that stuff, when you're winning, you know, maybe everybody else doesn't feel it around you quite as much. Maybe there's something that you give off that's the case, but you feel it. I felt it certainly. And I'm, but yeah, when you have a great year or the season ends really well, I mean, I think that there's certainly a lot of optimism. But I also think that there's the realization that what's next, what's coming, how hard it's going to be, and that you've got to give it everything you have to, again, just try to maximize your team in a world where sometimes that's not celebrated. And not sometimes, most of the time, that's not celebrated. And Chris made a really interesting point about like players and the standards that we hold them to and everything else. I think a lot of times people can see when a player makes an error, and sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it's very obvious. A person misses a shot, turns the ball over in our world, falls asleep on defense, and it's clear as day that they were the person, whatever the case may be. What's not as obvious to the naked eye is coaching mistakes, because nobody really knows what that system was designed to do on that given play or for that 6-minute stretch. And nobody really knows what the play call was. And so coaches oftentimes obviously get plenty of scrutiny themselves, but oftentimes it's not really that stuff that you're really paying attention to when you're in it, right? And so I do think that, the standards are just different, and we're trying to be mindful of that. But I do think that internally, if you're good at it, you hold yourself to a really high one, and all that comes with being good. And regardless if you won or lost, you got a lot of work to do regardless.
Okay, Chris, I want to go to Brad on this one, and I want you to just listen to this and give me your response to this. So, Brad, when you're young, okay, and you're coming up and you're doing these things, I have to think it has to be hard to be labeled a media darling when really you're just being honest. So when people are saying he's so good, and you're just like, guys, I'm telling you, the players are the ones that are doing X, Y, and Z. And then the media's like, there he goes, being humble again. And you start to get trapped into this perception as a young coach. How do you navigate that piece?
Well, I said before, my goal in coaching was to give it everything I have, be myself, and try to maximize each team to the best of my ability and to help them have great experiences, right? At the same time, if you're going to eventually be moved on from, you want it to be for losing, not for, your actions, not for behavior, not for things that are, that you could have done better, especially, in the media. There's so much interaction when you're, especially at this level in the media, that I do think that, you can go from, being overly praised to overly scrutinized really quickly. But at the end of the day, it's just about how you treat people. And so do try to do that. Do try to do that well. And that can go from he's humble to he's boring real fast. And that's okay. My goal is not necessarily to be out at dinner with anybody that's asking me media questions. It's more to, help them do their job and then move on. But I don't worry about like you talked about, what's it like to be labeled like that? Again, the older you get, you don't care. And it's nothing against the people saying stuff, good or bad. Whatever. It's just not important. Right. I heard a really good line, and I think it's important that, the people that you call for advice the people that you really respect, the people that you lean on when things are hardest, those are the people that you need to take their criticism and or their praise a little bit more heartedly, and everybody else is, maybe it's their job, maybe it's their way of, you know, putting their best foot forward for whatever they do, but you shouldn't take it in that much, right? It's just not important in helping you be the best you can be for the group you're with.
Chris?
This time of the year, which is in November here, so it's late football season. And this is when it gets hard for coaches because the season's been long. It's 7 days a week, it's long hours, guys are worn out, hard losses, thrilling victories. It's super emotional. And this is kind of when I see it with coaches can start to lose it a little bit with the media, with fans. And I just think it's important to really understand this is part of the job. Your job is to handle these type of situations, to handle the media. They're going to ask you tough questions. They're going to criticize you. It comes with the territory. And if your standard for, as a coach is going to be up here, part of that is how you handle those things, and you don't take it personal. We get worn down, and then all of a sudden, we start taking things personal, and it's like Brad said it, the media, they have a job to do as well. And the real pro is going to help them do their job. And whatever they say, we're taking that with a grain of salt. It doesn't really mean much to us. Our advisors, our mentors, the people that are close to us, we need to lock in hard to those people at certainly this time of year. I just go back to always when it's really hard, when you're worn down, when it's an emotional loss, victory. What does that look like? What does that standard of coaching performance look like?
Chris, I want to stay with you for 1 second. So there's a quarterback that I was working with, and he basically had a 7-0 start at a previous school, and then he has another 7-0 start this year. And the challenge, he said, when his first time going through that, he said that every week from 7-0, you feel like you're halfway through the season, and really it's 25% through the season because the weeks beyond that 7-0 are so much different than the previous weeks. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I think when you get late, in the season, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of coaches are trying to prepare their team for what it looks like late in the season, maybe the month of November in football, because I do think it's different at that time, just like we're speaking about. We've been through a lot of things. Your team is different. You're a little bit different. And to be able to figure out how to perform at your very best late in the year looks and feels a lot different than early in the year. I've always felt like after every, and again, football's playing once a week, unlike basketball playing 2 and 3 times a week. But after every win or every loss, after every game, football wise, I had a different team, I had a different staff. And so what does that look like? Are we getting momentum? Is this good momentum? Are we having, are we feeling so good about ourselves that it kind of crosses the line into entitlement and we don't have to kind of work as hard? Or now we don't have that we just lost confidence. And it might not only be the whole team. It can be one side of the ball. It can be a position group. And so you're kind of looking at all these different phases because it is different from week to week, depending on where you are in the season and how you came out of that game.
Brad, do you just want to share how the best lesson you've learned on how long playoff series can be?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it both ways, right? I've seen an outcome, or a series of small things happen within one game that changes the complexion of a series. I think one of the biggest things that, and you talked about it a little bit with the quarterbacks seemingly thinking that a 7-0 start was only 25% of the season because of how much longer and harder each day feels after that. The stamina to get through a long season is a good character trait of a really good coach. It's a good character trait of a really good player. It's the same thing with a playoff series. You prepare yourself for the idea that when you play great and you win and some things go your way, that the next one is going to be much more difficult simply because of human nature, let alone all the tactical adjustments that are going to take place. You prepare yourself for the idea that when your team misses a few shots or the balls don't bounce your way on a day where you do most everything else right, that your best player and your head coach are going to get blasted in the media. That's coming. So you just go through it with the perspective of, we signed up for a series where we have to win 4 games before the other team wins 4 games. We're not doing it game by game. We're not doing it right away. We're going to have to do it minute by minute, possession by possession. And we're going to have be the team that has more stamina here. And that's easier said than done. Like I said earlier, it goes back to that. Sometimes it pays to be naive. When you're going through it for the first time, it's like, well, it's just, you don't really know what's going on. You don't really know what's happening. You're just kind of going along with the flow. But when you've been through a bunch of them, and you kind of know the ups and downs of it, and you don't get caught up in that, you really have an advantage.
Talk about one of the lessons you learned about the parade, and because the goal of young athletes is to be unaffected. That's how you can protect your energy. And when you have loud voices on the media platforms, and then you turn the corner and you see a fan base, what was the realization you had?
I think it's just a reminder. We talked about it, like, our guys, like I just said, our head coach, our best players, they're going to get heavily scrutinized when things don't go well. Sometimes they get scrutinized when things do go well, which, is just kind of the world we live in, right? And so it's kind of a reminder, again, that if you wrap your identity around that type of praise or those types of things, then, you're bound to always be at least yearning for more, and probably bound to be disappointed. But when you get on that parade route and you turn the corner and you see, 1+ million people, and they're all wearing Celtics jerseys, and they're all smiling, different races, different ages, mostly the same set of 5 or 6 Celtics uniforms, but they're all wearing them. It's a reminder of what's real, and sometimes what we tell ourselves is real is, if you take a step back, take a deep breath, walk around, spend time kind of taking it all in, I think that gives you good perspective. Now, not everybody's going to be cheering for you all the time either. You don't get a parade very often, but it is a good reminder that there are a lot of people that, are really invested in this. It's really meaningful. Sports are bigger than just the game. And also that, people you got more fans than you realize.
What's your biggest takeaway? When I asked our class that question, the most common response was, we expect our teams to be coachable, but are we as coaches holding ourselves to that same standard of coachability so that we can model what being coachable looks like? We always want to leave you with a few questions to think about. These questions, as well as a link to download the listening guide, can be found in the description of this episode. In case you want to roll through them now, I'll read them out, and feel free to pause after each one to give yourself time to think about your answer. Question 1, Brad said, if you wrap your identity around trophies, it won't be as fulfilling. We know this on paper, so why do so many people still do it? Question 2, Chris said, if you get close and don't achieve it, you think, if I would have got it, everything changes, and nothing changes. If you knew in your heart that nothing changes, how do you think that could be a competitive advantage? Question 3, Brad said, players are oftentimes held to a higher standard than coaches when it comes to selflessness. How do you think about that thought? And when have you seen it in your own life? Question 4, when it's never enough, you're always focused on what's next. How do you prevent yourself from falling into the trap of an unfulfilling journey? What makes it hard for you personally? Question 5, many people will say that confidence comes from preparation, but there's a line of diminishing returns. What's the best lesson you've learned about your line of diminishing returns? Thanks again for listening. And for more information on What Drives Winning, the books, the coaching lab, and the courses Brett and I teach, visit whatdriveswinning.com. See you next time.